Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the CoinGeek Weekly Livestream. I am your host, Mr. Kurt Wuckert Jr. Please like, subscribe, hit the alert bell, all that jazz. Let our digital overlords know that you do indeed wish to receive our content as directly into your brain as humanly possible. If you could share this around, we will be taking some live questions from the audience, potentially, if you're nice. But you got to let your friends know to go do that. So please go and do that. I also want to thank our sponsor before we start anything here. Rockwallet.com gives you non-custodial access to your BTC, BCH, BSV, Ethereum stablecoins, and the money stablecoin MNEE. I have screwed up the ad. Unbelievable. MNEE, the only gasless stablecoin in existence in the whole world. So you should check out Rockwallet.com. They have been delightfully good to us. And if you are so inclined, I would implore you, please read my pinned post on X. My article from CoinGeek.com came out this morning discussing privacy and OAuth and login systems using a Web3 paradigm. And I compare three really cool products: the Clerk product, the Privy product, and Sigma Auth. They are probably the three most serious competitors. Two of them have been acquired, one by I believe it was Stripe quite recently, and then the others. I mean, they're playing hard, they're playing big, and looking to sort of end the paradigm of log in with Facebook and log in with X and log in with Google, where you give Facebook, X, and Google access to all of your data, and they can follow you around the internet and see what you actually like, so they can advertise to you in the best case scenario. But also, we have evidence that they have, not even evidence, we have convictions in some cases that those people have sold your data to all kinds of nefarious parties, including global intelligence agencies and other people who you probably don't want having your phone number. So we walk through how to solve some of those privacy concerns on the internet using some of these new technologies. And I give some of my opinions of it in the end. I would love your feedback. So if you check me out, my pinned post on X, I would love your commentary. It's not a long article, but attention spans are getting smaller and smaller. So we do our best, everybody. Our guest today is Seth Levine, venture capitalist out of Boulder, Colorado, who you may recognize if you pay attention to the Boulder, Colorado venture capitalist scene, which is probably a subset within a subset of the niche of the people that watch this show. But you may recall I had Brad Feld on a few months ago and talked quite a bit about the power of venture capital in the Web3 space, but also bringing the whole world together in a place where we don't have to think of venture capital as such a dirty term. I think they really get a bad rap in a lot of ways. And guys like Brad and guys like Seth, as I'm sure you will understand by the end of this interview, are really trying to explain to people the power of capital and capitalism in such a way that it benefits people, not just on the board of directors or not just the big stakeholders, but ultimately benefits all of us. We can thank venture capital for a lot of the benefits of the internet and technology and industrial manufacturing and all kinds of things around the world. And so it's not just a gruesome group of people that are only thinking about money. We also have a lot to thank them for. And so I'm looking forward to a really good conversation with Seth. His book, I had to speed read it because I only had access to it for a few days, but it's a lot of fun. So I'm looking forward to having that on. So again, like, subscribe, hit the alert bell, all of that stuff. We're going to take a very quick break, and we will be back with Seth Levine. Seth, welcome to the show, sir.
Kurt, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely.
I'm hoping to prove to you that I don't just think about money, right? As a VP, that was quite the intro. I feel a little bit like I got to prove myself now, which is good, right?
Yeah, no pressure. Honestly, I really liked your book. It's always a mix of things when you talk about capitalism in and of itself, because I think actually the term is really poorly understood by a lot of people. And the really fun thing about your book is that I think, depending on which chapters you read And depending on what your political disposition is, I think you could make the right or the left love you, or you can make the right or left hate you, depending on which parts are red.
100%.
And I think that's actually what makes it good, because I think you're cutting through sort of the nonsense, the collectivist meme that exists on both sides. And so if you could, maybe let's start with defining terms a little bit. Like, in your opinion, what is capitalism? What is like socialism or neoliberal, whatever, versus, in a basic sense, what is dynamic capitalism?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. Let me I'll take it up one level and then go straight to those questions. So you mentioned it's like one of the reasons we decided to write the book is because it felt like capitalism as a concept was kind of under threat, right? And this was probably 3.5 years ago when we decided to write the book. A lot of research, talked to some really interesting people, sort of all up and down sort of the corporate world, but including people like Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, Dan Schulman, who's now the just newly announced CEO of Verizon. He was the CEO of PayPal at the time we spoke to him. So and then lots of people sort of all the way down the sort of the chain in a corporation. So we really wanted to get perspectives. But one of the things that inspired us to write it was that we saw a statistic. I'm using the we term because I wrote the book with a friend of mine. Actually, this is our second book together, Elizabeth McBride, who's a business journalist. By the way, she and I don't always agree. And so maybe what you're seeing a little bit of the back and forth is like,
that could be,
It might be a little bit of that. We didn't exactly like, I wrote one chapter, she wrote another one. It was not quite that discreet, but we had some tension, which was really good in the writing process. But it turns out something like 45% of people under the age of 40 don't think that capitalism works, and they're interested in something else, right? And obviously we just saw that instantiated in the New York election result, right? I mean, the idea that
big time.
I'm old and I'm 53. Like when I was 25, if someone said they were a socialist, like that was the end of their political career. And now it's like a whole movement, right? Of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. It was tried in San Francisco, worked pretty poorly, and they sort of came back. It was kind of tried in Minneapolis, actually, and that didn't work as well, and sort of come back. But, I think what happens is that when large groups of people feel disenfranchised from the economy, and they feel like they have no shot at being participants in the market economy or being capitalists, let's say, they look for alternatives, right? And it's sort of maybe one of the reasons that the book potentially appeals to people on both the right and the left is that they're kind of driven by populism, whether it's right-wing populism or left-wing populism, sort of driven by the same underlying factors, the kind of things we talk about in the book, which is capitalism isn't working for a lot of people, right? So, and one of the things so when you're writing a book about capitalism, you have to define capitalism. You asked me that question, so I will finally get around to actually answering it. And it took us a while to like kind of figure it out. Like you think, okay, we're going to just start with like, what is capitalism? And then we'll start writing from there. We were like 2/3 of the way done writing by the time we were like, okay, this is how we're going to describe capitalism, because it was sort of elusive to us. I mean, I was a psychology major, so maybe that actually is perfect to be like talking about it. But I had always thought about capitalism as like an economic construct, but it kind of isn't, right? It really is more a social construct, right? And we define it in the book as sort of this grand bargain, this agreement between people and each other and the government, right? In terms of how we're going to organize a society. And one of the things that we sort of argue for in the book is that just because we've been practicing neoliberal capitalism, which is like the Milton Friedman shareholders are the only thing that matters style of capitalism for basically the last 50 years. So probably the lifetime of just about everyone, myself included, who's listening to and a part of this podcast. Just because that's how it's been doesn't mean that's either how it always has been, because it wasn't, or how it always will be. And I think that that's what we really try to describe in the book is like, the answer is not collectivism, right? The answer is not socialism. The answer isn't free stuff for whoever wants it. The answer is create more capitalists, right? And I think that's really important. And I'll relate it to sort of the topic that people listening to this podcast care the most about, which is sort of Web3 and crypto. And one of the things that I think we can learn from crypto is this sort of like open systems, open architecture, right? And I think that it allows people to participate in markets in a way that they've historically not been able to. And it allows a bunch of things, and maybe we'll get into all of those things. But in particular, it really allows people to participate in markets in a way that I think bolsters their buy-in to markets, and therefore I think creates more capitalists. And so the book itself is not like a policy book in any sense, but at the end, we sort of do talk about some political ideas or some policy ideas. And amongst those are essentially enabling people to be capitalists more, right? So that could be the baby bond stuff that Trump finally got around to doing, but we've been talking about for a while. Actually, that was one of the suggestions even in our last book was this baby bond thing. But also just sort of like empowering the ownership economy, like all of the things to like get people to participate in the market economy, because ultimately, if you're not participating in the market economy, then it's really easy to, take someone who's telling you that, this should be free and that should be free and you shouldn't be paying more rent or whatever it is. And say, yeah, that sounds great. Like, I think that'll help me. And even though ultimately, I believe this firmly, so I'm going to say it as a very definitive statement. And, others might debate this, but like, we know that won't work. Right. If we stabilize rent, we will have a short-term view of like, great, rents don't go up for some subset of people for a very short period of time. And then no one will build houses, and then we'll just exacerbate the problem. There's a reason why the housing cost of housing is not as big an issue in Texas as it is in California. It's because you can build houses in Texas. Right.
Well, and so that's the thing, I knew who you were from the venture capital space, but I when I saw the book and the basic title, I'm like, okay, where is this going to go? Right? Is he, the next socialist guy that's going to, try to re-explain, what capitalism should be? And I came away from it really feeling empowered, because it's much more of almost like a small business mindset. Like, each individual person should have the ability to grow their own life. And I think that really is the grand vision of what capitalism should be in the first place. I mean, you can go all the way back to, Smith or whatever. And so that's kind of the vision that he was pushing out a few hundred years ago, that, well, look, if capital has free flow and people are competing, you get the best outcomes for the most people, because competition should benefit the individual. But then it's turned into this weird sort of corporatist monster. And when you look at like politicians, every politician runs as a populist and then they govern as a corporatist, right? And so it doesn't matter what party you're from or where it started. Like, I'm from Chicago originally, and so I remember the whole Obama revolution. And it's like, change has come, and it was like, yeah, but at the end of the day, he was basically just as corporatist as anybody else. And then you get the throwback. You get Trump turning into this right-wing populist thing, and but then how did he govern? And so it's lots of it's difficult to systematize, because I think most people want there to be a system. Most people want to hear like, okay, here's the math, here's the structure, and here's what you get at the end of it. Because how many people are macroeconomists, right? And but where the rubber hits the road, it really is like everybody actually functions as a capitalist anyways, like including the kind of people that are receiving SNAP benefits and some of these other things. It's like, okay, well, I'm just going to set my budget with that. I'll sell the SNAP budget stuff that I don't use to other people. And like, they're creating a micro-capitalist economy with their welfare, even at that level. And I think, just to explain to people that, capitalism is not just the big banks deciding what the government is going to do. And, it's this weird top-down policy thing. It's just so much more empowering. So I really like the way that you structured it in true populism at its base level, is that, hey, populism is about the population. It's about you.
Right.
So I wanted to say congrats. Like, I quite liked the book, even though I came into it expecting to be a skeptic and have a difficult interview, but I actually quite liked it. So
no, I appreciate that a lot. And actually, we took great pains to like, that really means a lot to me, because we took great pains to try to write a book that was thought-provoking, not super political, because we don't, I actually am relatively political. I think about politics a lot, but
sure.
I wanted to just like paint a roadmap for something that I thought was just sort of wrong in the world. And I like to say to people, like, look, I'm capitalist by job title. I believe, right?
Yeah.
Like, I believe in it. And and I'm a venture capitalist, so I am any capitalist am a capitalist by job title. So like I want to defend that system. It's been incredibly powerful for me and my family, and I've done really well in this system that rewarded, for starters, a huge amount of risk taking. Right? We don't like Foundry was started. My venture firm was started nearly 20 years ago, but when I started Foundry, it was a little bit of a different time in terms of how you started venture firms. We had to, there was a bunch of legal, and we literally had to write like an offering document. It looked like an IPO prospectus, stuff like that. It was, for me, and all of my money on the table moment. And not only that, but maybe like 3 months into starting to raise our first fund, it looked like it wasn't going to happen. And I actually came home one night we started raising at the end of January. By like April, May, I came home and I said to my wife, I think I lost our savings. Now, I was not particularly wealthy, so it was not, it was a 6-figure sum, but not a crazy amount of money.
When it's all you got, it's all you got. Yeah.
And by the way, we had, 2 kids, and like it was, and I said, I think I'm going to have to, I think I lost our life savings, and I'm going to have to get a job. And it was, look, I had job prospects. Like I wasn't like, oh my God, we're going to be on the street. I don't want to overplay it. But there was absolutely a moment where I was like, I think I lost all the money that I put into this. And of course, my wife was awesome about it. And she was like, no, it's going to be fine. The things that somebody support you says.
Sounds like a good wife. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, exactly. We can do it for like 25 years now. But I say that story because like that's capitalism, right? Like maybe it wouldn't have worked out and I would have had a totally different life and I would have figured it out. But of course, I believe in myself. Like I was going to do something. I don't know that it would have generated this kind of, economic return for me that Foundry did, but like it would have been something I would have been fine. But that Foundry happened because we took the risk. And I am such a believer in doing that, right? And enabling a society where that actually exists. So, that's like a lot of what we talk about is sort of that sort of thing. Like, how do we create a society that actually enables people to sort of, get on the American dream, ladder, if you will. And we're kind of moving away from that as a society. Again, I didn't know these stats when I wrote the book. I was super surprised to learn that 25 and 50 years ago, if you were born in the bottom 25% of the wealth sort of bracket, if you will, in the country, you had about it's easy to say because it's easy to remember. You had about a 25% chance of ending your life in the top 25%, right? So there's tons of economic mobility. Now, if you are born in the bottom 25%, you have a 5% chance of to me, that is like it as a capitalist, that hurts me because we are not pulling the best out of our collective society because there are people that should be rich, meaning they should create value, right? Because you don't get rich by not creating value, ultimately, generally speaking, for other people, right? And for society, like we should be richer as a society if we enabled people to have more mobility. So, that pains me.
And that's a big part of, my public work in Bitcoin is exactly that. I look at that and say, you know what, there's 3 or 4 billion people on Earth that don't really have practical access to the global economy. And a big part of that is it's communications, it's access to capital, it's access to even just, basic e-commerce tooling and these kind of things. And Bitcoin was supposed to reduce that friction. And, I want to live in a world where, maybe there's 50,000 world-class entrepreneurs that are totally ring-fenced out of that global economy. But, how many Steve Jobses live in places where they're stuck, working the quote unquote family business, which is, just whatever dad did and grandpa did and great grandpa did. And they're stuck there. But in reality, if we could give them that access, we ultimately get to benefit from it, right? Like that's the power of it.
People sometimes don't understand is like, I think there's this view amongst people that, whatever, I guess are socialists or socialist curious or whatever it is that like somehow capitalism, like it only benefits a small number of people. And it is true. Wealth is concentrated and probably over concentrated in the US. I don't believe the solution to that is to make the wealthy people less wealthy. I think the solution to that is to make the less wealthy people more wealthy, right? Like grow the pie, as you will. And I totally, I love the analogy to sort of crypto and Bitcoin specifically, because, I think about like what happened. Like Bitcoin should be for banking, or crypto generally should be for banking, what like cell phones were to communications, right? Like if you go back to the 80s, most people in most places had absolutely no way of communicating with anyone else, right? And it just didn't exist, right? And you would go, if you went to these sort of developing nations, and you would go down like a back alley, there'd just be like a rat's nest of like telecoms lines and things like that, and very few people could afford a home phone line. And then what happened in many of these developing countries is that mobile, cellular technology like leapfrog.
Yeah, 100%.
Everything, right? And they just enabled this whole group of people. So like if you go to some of these developing nations now, like everyone has a cell phone, and it's incredibly empowering because many of them are smartphones, right? Thank goodness for Android. Now we've got these sort of inexpensive operating systems and these super cheap flat platforms, and many people can afford a cell phone, and it just gives them more opportunity. And yet so many of these people are outside of the banking system because traditional banking is kind of like the landline telephony world, right? Where it's just like
for sure
efficient, and stuff just takes time and is expensive, et cetera. And my belief is that crypto helps us leapfrog that. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what's in many respects most exciting about Web3 and crypto.
Well, and I think the other thing in theory, so I'm a big critic of inflation, and I think inflation is also a big bipartisan problem. Every president spends more than the president before them, and I think that's a big reason why we see that stratification, is that if you already own equity in things, inflation is good for you. It makes it that your stuff gets more valuable. Yeah. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, your purchasing power is just trending down. It's been trending down for 100 years or more, and that trend keeps getting worse too. And so, like, fixing the money, I think, is another thing where, again, like when people think of capitalism, they think of that sort of fat cat, like, well, of course, Bank of America and JP Morgan, like they get the money first and they pay their bills with more powerful money than I get. And so there's a sort of weird trickle down on bad money, essentially. And is that something that you address? I don't recall it being addressed in the book. Is it something that you've addressed elsewhere? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we don't talk about monetary policy specifically in the book, but I have a lot of thoughts on it, right? I mean, my biggest critique of the BBB was like, I mean, look, the U.S. elections have consequences, right? And so at some point, like, you get what the country voted for, and there's plenty of pieces of the BBB that I was not a fan of, but the thing that I was most just frustrated with was like, why are we adding trillions of dollars to the deficit? Not even the debt, right? Like,
it's insane.
Every year, not just trillions of dollars.
Right.
It just feels like it's unsustainable, and the only ways out of it are either some massive increase in productivity, which maybe we're on with AI. Maybe that could happen. Now, there might be some second order effects to increasing productivity to certain job functions, for example, and things like that. Or you inflate your way out, and you're 100% right, Kurt. Like for people like you and me, all right, it's like there's more inflation, there's more inflation. I'm actually pretty long bonds right now anyway, because I've got a pretty risky, high risk portfolio in venture. Like,
sure.
I actually wouldn't mind if the bond prices ticked up a little bit, or bond yields tick up a little bit. Like that's good for me. That is not good for the average person, right? And I at least am conscious enough to recognize like that's bad. But those are the ways you get out of this. And so, thank goodness the US dollar continues to be the reserve currency. Obviously, we were able to support more debt than we'd originally thought. But like at some point, that's going to run out. And by the way, the other thing that no one ever talks about is like the Fed balance sheet went from, essentially zero, right? I mean, there was a statutory requirement for the Fed to have certain reserves, but we're talking about like 50 billion in reserves. It went up to like trillions of dollars, right? In the GFC, and then it was tightened slightly, but still like really high. And now it's going up again, right? So quantitative easing is the friendly name of it. But and it's not bad that there's a Fed balance sheet, but when you combine massive deficits and this huge Fed balance sheet, like, it just isn't, as someone who is studied economics, like understands some amount of economics. I don't know where the line is, but it feels like we should address that. But no politician ever got elected by being like, hey, I'm going to cut some services and I think everyone was like cheering hard for Elon and Doge, right? Like, like,
conceptually, the pamphlet version of Doge was maybe the most exciting thing that has happened in 20 years.
We're going to look at these programs and be like, hey, is there too much? And I think one of the things that's structurally problematic about the U.S. It's the deficit and debt, as you described. It's the Fed balance sheet that we just touched on. But you know what? It's also the percentage of our employment that is driven by the government, meaning directly, like government pays your actual paycheck, and this is this like shadow thing I think people don't look at, is government adjacent, but still reliant on government. So these would be defense contractors and things like that. Yeah. And so while we've kind of held or even shrunk the government workforce, the government contractor workforce has ballooned, right? And so something close to like 50% of Americans have a job that relies on the government. And, you know, I mean, whatever you think about ultimately the dude or his policies, like just go to Argentina and see what happens. One, when you embrace collectivism, right? And he has some kind of great speeches that he's given on that.
Indeed,
and too, like what happens when, 60, 70% of people are essentially reliant on the government for their job. It just, it just doesn't work. So those are trends I worry about. I'd love for someone to, start to address those. Frankly, I had hoped, like to your point, the pamphlet version of Doge was like, maybe they'll start dealing with that. I don't want to, it was, I'm sure, an incredibly hard job. I don't want to pretend I have any idea how difficult it was to go through that. I thought there was maybe a little bit of like too much Silicon Valley in like, go fast and break things. That I don't think that really works in government. So I think maybe a little bit more judicious use of the red pen.
And that's the hard thing, right? Because in capitalism, like when you get to the position you're in, like I'm guessing you have a relationship with people like Reid Hoffman and some of these other people, because I saw that he wrote a comment about your book, and so. But if you're Elon Musk, who also I'm sure has his cell phone number, and you look at it and say, we have this program that is downstream really helping out my friends over here, like it starts to become a problem when you're the guy who's going to say, hey, we're going to cut off that flow of money to you. And then it turns into like, well, then we're going to cut off our flow of, donations and all. Like, so we have this it's problematically nepotistic.
Yeah.
And then, but it becomes so hard because you're cutting the head off of people who you might have had lunch with 6 months ago. And it's like, hey, this is my job. And it's not my money and it's not your money. It's the money of the American people that we're trying to make this work for. And, then you're asking everybody to take a personal hit for the sake of, essentially the greater good or some kind of altruistic, like, hey, in 50 years, we're going to be glad that I took a haircut for the sake of the country. But I think that's where it starts to get really hard. And one of the major themes that stuck out in your book is like this sort of restoring the legitimacy of the democracy, which I think on all sides, people feel like their voice doesn't matter. Their vote is, maybe all the elections are fake anyways. And no matter who you vote for, like whatever. But restoring legitimacy, that's one of those things where, hey, you got to cut the heads off of people that you might otherwise like and who would have otherwise liked you, but you're the one saying, hey, we're cutting off your flow of capital. And is there even a way to do that in such a way that doesn't essentially incite negativity and really incite because they have their political future to think about too. And I think that's a really problematic part of things, is that campaign finance and all these other things are also tangled up in your economic policy. And is there a way around that? Or, what would you do with a magic wand and, whatever else in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, wow, I would love a magic wand because I've got lots of thoughts on what to do. One of the things we talk about is it's not just like restoring democracy or in that, that's like a broad topic, but like it's sort of restoring decency and restoring debate. And one of the things that I really took out of writing the book, because I really wanted to expose myself to a lot of different ideas, is this notion of like, we've gotten to this point where we've got this like almost like this purity test, right? And I think people are guilty of this on both sides of the political aisle. I think it was very acute for a while it sort of ebbs and flows. Like it was very acute for a while on the Democratic side. And I thought the Republicans actually did a pretty good job of being like, well, we've got MAGA, but we've got all these other types of people too. And now that seems to have shifted a little bit, where the Democrats are starting to embrace like, okay, I guess we got these socialists, but we also have Abby Spanberger some other people that are a little bit more, Listen Slock and other people that are a bit more centrist. And then the Republican side has maybe become a bit more purist. Being a purist is problematic. And I think we sometimes expect this in all of our relationships, right? And so there's not a lot of room for expression, experimentation, discussion, debate, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the fun upsides for me of writing the book is I now have a much broader group of at least podcasts that I listen to. It's an easy way, right? Whether you're, you lean one, left or you lean right, it's pretty easy to find. Again, I'm not talking about like going to the socialist website or going to the whatever OAN website and getting my news.
Right.
But there's a lot of really interesting people that I think are really smart on both sides of the political aisle that I'm trying to listen to because I want to understand sort of how they think about things, right? And I pick up ideas and I learn from them. And so, I think what you are describing sort of at its core is this unwillingness at times, although Reed, I think, actually is willing to engage in these debates, right? There's a couple of, it's not
I just picked him because he's a well-known,
and he's on the back cover of the book because,
right.
he's a guy that I know reasonably well. And I reached out and said, hey, would you mind writing an endorsement? And so, you go to the back, people go to the back of the book and, you try to find a couple of names that people have heard of. So they can, it's validation basically because no one knows who Seth Levine is, at least not yet.
Right.
But I think like being open to and engaging in these discussions. And actually, when you get to the very end of the book, we do talk about like, if you want to take a good practical step towards sort of embracing what we call dynamic capitalism, which is this sort of like not quite so hardcore neoliberal version of capitalism. But like start by just like talking to people around you that don't necessarily have the same views. And I think one of the things that's been true, at least in my lifetime, is it feels like more and more people that I am spending time with are relatively close to me in terms of their overall like worldview and political belief. And that's kind of a bummer, right? So now the upside, as I mentioned, is there's a really rich world of podcasts. And so you can grab ideas from lots of different places and be exposed to it. And if it really offends you, I mean, maybe check yourself. Like, why am I finding it so hard to listen to?
Right.
I disagree with. Like, I don't have to adopt those ideas, but let me hear them out. But if it really, really, really offends you, then get off. And one of the things I sort of like about Gavin Newsom's podcast is at least he's had like Steve Bannon and he had actually the Charlie Kirk one was pretty good. I mean, maybe he didn't quite push Charlie on some of the things he said that I would have been interested to hear his response to, but at least he's been willing to have some people on his podcast.
Right.
And frankly, those are, I think, the only ones I ever really listen to is like, when he has whatever politician that thinks exactly like him on, like, I don't care. Like, I know what Gavin Newsom thinks. I know what this other person thinks.
Well, right. It's not interesting. Well, and actually it's funny because same thing, I think of Gavin Newsom as fundamentally somebody that I don't particularly like, and I disagree with him more than I agree, but I did the same thing. I watched the Charlie Kirk interview. As soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, this could be really interesting, because again, like they probably disagree on 85% of the issues, but are both well-spoken. And, it's that kind of thing that makes us learn both sides, right? So you're going to bring right-wingers to Gavin's show.
Bureau on like a month ago, and it was like, I listened to it twice. It was just interesting, right? And they did even a better job. And Newsom kind of glad handles his yes, he's not the best podcaster in that way, but Ezra and Ben really kind of went at it in a way that I thought was super interesting, and I think they're both smart dudes. Yep.
No, I think that's really great. And actually, so on this topic, you are this capitalist, and the book came across as very capitalistic. But the one thing that stood out to me that was a little bit opposite of that is how much you discussed climate, and so when I think about climate, like climate change, for 20 years it was global warming, and now it's global climate change, and it's one of those issues where I think before the pandemic probably was the most divisive issue among people as to like why like I don't trust your data and you don't trust my data, and everybody's a villain if you're on the opposite side. And I'm curious, like how do you? I'm just curious how you came to your basic worldview on it, but then also like what are some practical steps to solving this problem? Because I'm on the fence whether or not I think global warming is fundamentally a man-made issue. I think there's merit to both sides of the discussion, But where I'm always lost is if it's a man-made phenomenon, what the heck do we do? Like, what is an actual practical direction that we can take to make sure that this planet is inhabitable for the next 50 or 500 years?
Yeah, and inhabitable by humans specifically. Right?
Correct. Yeah.
I'm not worried about that. The planet will be inhabitable for a long time.
Now that you mention, I think that's the thing that gets lost in the wash too, is that ultimately it's humanity, right? Like the planet will be here forever, until the sun explodes, right?
But 5 billion years. We got
but really, how do we make it that is not just inhabitable, but hospitable to humanity and our ultimate growth toward, whatever it is we can become?
Yeah. So I have a few opinions on this, but I want to start by saying that my belief is that humans contribute to climate change. So I believe that is true. And it sort of doesn't matter. Like the debate actually around that is probably not as important as like, are there things that we should do, let's say, to lessen the impact of climate change?
Right.
And I think about it from just more of like a practical standpoint. So first I should say, well, I guess second, because I already said first. Second, I should say, as a techno optimist, like I actually think we're going to be fine, right? Like I strongly believe that there will be technology, probably already exists today, but even if it doesn't, like we will figure out technologies that will help us either adapt to or more likely lessen the impacts of climate change. So I believe that it's an existential threat in the sense that if we don't deal with it, we will have to change things around how we live, and that has implications for where you can build a house and how you can insure that house and where you can produce things and things like that. Which is why like the U.S. Navy has done a whole bunch of research on climate change because their boats are all in ports and they care about whether their bases that are on the ports are going to be sustainable or whatever. It is one area. So I'd say a couple other things about it. It is we generally in the book take a pretty skeptical view about government intervention. We have an entire chapter on essentially like government isn't the solution, but it's not the problem either. And so, so in our general view, it's like government intervention should be the absolute minimum required to achieve the result. Climate is an area where sort of maybe setting the boundaries would be helpful for the government. I believe that there are capitalistic like solutions to dealing with how we treat, let's just say pollution, whether you think it leads to climate change or not. I would love to see capitalistic solutions to that, right? Which is basically put a price on carbon, you trade it, like all of that I think makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really important to recognize that the US won the 20th century because we were the best producers of energy on the entire planet. Right. Those
for
are all
sure.
fossil fuels essentially, but like that, like the oil and gas won the 20th century for the US. I think energy becomes even more important in the 21st century, right? We already know AI uses a lot of energy, but all of the things that we're talking about in terms of new technologies, quantum, and even just the electrification of much of our transport infrastructure, like all of that requires energy. And so we absolutely need to be investing in energy solutions. And we say this very clearly in the book, like this notion that we're like going to get off fossil fuels by 2030 or whatever, like it just doesn't make any sense.
That's crazy.
We're going to lose the 21st century if that's how we approach things. And by the way, that's not how China approaches things.
That's what I was going to say. China, we're going to lose everything to China if we decide to hamstring ourselves.
They have 35 nuclear power plants that are in, like in production right now, right? Like we have like one or two. I mean, it's just like, it makes no sense. And we have these 4th gen reactors now that are super safe, that can be placed in different places that sort of don't have that same infrastructure. It just doesn't. I mean, of course, we're seeing. I grew up in the Northeast, so 3 Mile Island was like I remember. I don't remember when it happened, but I knew what it was sort of for my whole life. And now, like was it Microsoft? I think who bought it, and they're gonna like spin it back up. But the vast majority of U.S. nuclear infrastructure, for example, just to pick one, is aging, right? I mean, it's like 50 years old on average.
Right, and that's a bigger problem.
Let's invest in that, right? I mean, I don't know why we pulled back on the wind and other stuff, other than like I guess Trump thinks windmills are ugly. Like I want it to be. I think the solution here is and not or. Like we should be doing wind and solar and some amount of fossil fuel and nuclear and all of that. And we highlight in the, I don't know if you got to this chapter yet, but we highlight companies like Occidental Petroleum and sort of talk about, because they're really leading the world and thinking about how we put technology solutions in place that can help lessen the pollutive impact of burning fossil fuels. Like the solution to climate has to be partnering with BP and Occidental and all of these large oil and gas companies. And so I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of generally how I've been thinking about it. And I'm very optimistic about that. Like I think we can both win the 21st century energy race and lessen sort of the overall footprint of pollution.
Well, and that's why I brought it up, because it's one of those issues where, depending on how it's framed, it either comes across as really divisive or, nobody wants to live in, pollution. Like, it's like, well, is there lead in my water? Am I, well, everybody's full of microplastics, but these kind of things. And it's like, okay, is the microplastic thing related to the rise in cancer over the last 20 years? And, like lots of those little things where nobody wants to live in a situation where you're growing a horn out of your head because, some petroleum company, some plastics company kills you.
Mexico City or Beijing or something like that. I mean, I don't need a scientist sitting next to me to look at, or even in Colorado where I live, not very often anymore, but there used to be these conversions and whatever. Like you fly into the smog and you're like, I'm pretty sure that's not good for me.
Right. Well, and that's the optimism. And, so I bring it up because I wanted to highlight how you do get some people, like even Bill Gates has talked about, like, well, we need, massive decline in population. It's like, okay, well, if so, how though, right? And then you get some like really awful things have been said by like the World Economic Forum, and then you start getting, you start telling, like the conspiracy theorists are going to immediately be like, that guy wants to kill half the planet for the sake of the planet. Like, what are we doing, right?
Movie? Like, you get the ring and the glove, and the half the population dies. I mean, that doesn't sound like a solution to anything.
Yeah. Right. And so again, to approach that and to say like, look, we need to talk about nuclear again. Right. So it's funny to be like two issues, right? Like green, hey, climate change, but then, hey, the solution is nuclear, and you're going to split the political divide with those two, concepts. But it's wild to me, because the more that I learn about nuclear, the more I'm like, man, this should be the Democratic Party's whole thing. I mean, it's literally like your exhaust is steam, and done properly, which we're obviously more than capable of doing properly. It's the solution to a massive chunk of the pollution, and therefore, however you feel about whether carbon is good or carbon is bad, and blah blah blah. Can we all agree that steam as your exhaust in a really safe nuclear reactor giving us very cheap power is a good thing?
And the price of power needs to come down, right? The price of it. So I totally agree. By the way, this might be an interesting statistic, Kurt. Like, do you know how many people in the United States have died from nuclear power accidents since essentially the invention of nuclear power?
Yeah, probably less than a dozen would be my guess.
0. The number is 0. Yeah. So even in I actually didn't know that. Like I was like, well, someone must have died at 3 Mile Island. Like that was. I'm Googling it because I had read that statistic somewhere, and I was like, oh, wow, no one died in that. Like there has not been a nuclear accident. And by the way, Gen 4 reactor. I mean, Gen 2 reactors are safer than 3 Mile Island, but like Gen 4 reactors are essentially incapable of melting down, right? Which is the big kind of worry. So I totally agree. And I will say one of my biggest disappointments in the Trump administration is that he had talked a big talk about some stuff on immigration that I wish he would get to more, right? In terms of like, how do we keep more people in the US that are studying here and things like that. And he talked about, in particular, nuclear power, but just sort of expanding the US power footprint. And I think that these two things are so critical, right? One is human capital and one is the power to power everything. And I just having studied now in depth, how did we win? And the US like declaratively won the 20th century, right? In terms of capitalism by every metric you can think of. How did we win that? We won it because we were an incredible attractor of talent, and we have the best university system, training system in the entire world. And we won the power game, right? And so, that that will also win the next century. And I'd like to see us investing in those two things heavily.
Yeah. So see, let's address Nick here. Nick saying that, the conversation on screen is getting a bit pro-green. Green policies fighting climate change are currently destroying the UK economy. It's a Labour Party obsession. And I think this is the thing where people, they hear about green energy, green policy, and they hear like, okay, my taxes are going up. They're going to make me sleep in the cold in the winter. And, like these kind of things. How do we get past like those sort of reactive knee-jerk policy problems that are negatively impacting? I think the UK is actually a great example of over-regulation and actually harming your citizenry. And
I'm sorry for our UK listeners. Like, as a general matter, I wouldn't follow UK policy on almost anything, right? Like, I don't think they've done a good job managing any of this, and I think climate is a great example of it. That's why, I hope I didn't sound too sort of left on the climate thing, because I actually feel very pragmatic about it, right? Which is one of the reasons I wanted to frame it. I mean, I did want to say, like, I do believe the climate is changing. I do believe that we're contributing to that. That's actually not a value judgment. That's just a statement of like, I do think that's happening, right? If we don't think that humans are contributing to climate change, and we should burn as many fossil fuels as we want. So it kind of doesn't make sense for me to sort of argue around carbon capture and things like that if I don't at least set that up. But I believe very strongly that we need to be really careful about how we craft policy, which is why I push back so hard on these like firm dates when we stop burning any fossil fuel. And that doesn't work.
That's crazy.
And the politicization of our politics, especially in the US, but you see it in the UK as well and elsewhere, is such that, like, for whatever reason, there's like a series of things like the Green New Deal, and I call it out directly in the book. Like, I think it's fucking stupid. Sorry.
It's fine. Only adults watch the show.
There you go. I've been trying not to swear, but I got
no, totally fine. Yeah.
Like, we call that kind of stuff out because it's not helpful to debate. It's a bunch of really bad policy ideas that are totally unrealistic, that are never going to end up happening. And I have some friends who are politicians that have like signed on to it, and I've been like, what are you doing? And they're very pragmatic would be one word. Cynical would be another word about it, where they're just sort of like, well, like that's my constituency and they want to see me doing it. Like, that conversation, I don't think gets us anywhere. Right. And so I think what your listener from the UK is saying is exactly right, which is like, hey, forget about the charge stuff. Let's talk about how do we produce more power? What is the best way to reduce the cost of producing power? Right. And ultimately, like solar, the incremental cost of solar is zero. Right. Because it's like free atoms from the sky. And just as one example, I'm not saying that the whole world should be solar. Obviously, there's cost of like, you got to produce the solar arrays, and you got to have the transport and all of that. So it's not like totally free. But, if we could each have distributed power of some kind, even that could be even in a world that could be nuclear. Right. I actually would be open to having like a little mini nuclear plant at my house.
The exact same thing. Right. This big little cube in your backyard. Yeah.
It's not feasible right now, but like, not feasible in whatever, pick some time frame, 20 years.
Agreed. Yeah.
But like something like that would make more sense, right? I mean, how much power gets lost? I think it's 30%, just like transporting all around, right? We're trying to, push these atoms to God knows where, including my house. And I would much rather be producing energy, sort of at the source. And you see that already in the data center world. These AI data centers are like kind of coming up with their own power plants. Right. And they're like, okay, we got to control this key input to this data center. Right. And so we've got to have our own power.
So if you haven't looked into it, I'd encourage you to look into the Satoshi Action Fund. What they do, they are basically treating Bitcoin mining like one of the most consumptive industries in the world, but becoming an adjacent partner to the power industry and saying, look, instead of having these massive grid shedding stations and all these other things, what if we have this curtailment agreement with you that during times of non-peak power use, we mine at a discount, but when it's too hot and everybody needs the electricity, we'll agree to turn down. And so instead of saying, hey, we can't reinvest in building newer, better, or more power plants, that you can actually build them because we can consume that power. And we have the ability to very simply be an on and off switch at the end of the grid for you. And so it's sort of repositioned over the last 3 years, Bitcoin being part of the green technology movement and saying, hey, you're spending $1 billion a year on grid shedding, which is essentially spinning an inefficient wheel in order to just consume power at the end of the grid and say, hey, let us be that wheel. We're actually turning it into this productive asset and all these other things. And so, that's been a big step in the right direction. And then the other one is trapped energy. So anywhere where there's like flare gas or methane or even garbage dumps that are just giving off tons of this nonsense, you can cap it and turn a generator with it, and you can mine, because you don't have that big data requirement for mining. So you can literally put a mining operation almost anywhere on Earth where there would be otherwise trapped or potentially polluting gases that are leaking out of the earth, and you can monetize it and actually start to build communities around it and that kind of thing. So, with your interest in power, I think you should take a good look at some of the opportunities there for mining.
I just wrote it down. And by the way, it's a great example of why capitalism is awesome, right?
Yes.
We should be seeking out. I mean, the reason that works is because it pays to mine Bitcoin that way. And so you create creative solutions to what would otherwise be complete waste, right? And I love that about it.
Yeah.
By the way, it's a really good point, right? Like, one of the challenges with the grid in the US is as a general matter, we produce a ton of energy, right?
Too much, yeah.
Yeah, and oftentimes too much. The problem is that we have these sort of peak spikes, and there's not a really good way to deal with these peak spikes, right?
Yeah. It's a huge solution to a problem that's plagued us for 50, really since the baby boom created this need for the rapid growth in infrastructure.
Yeah. So, and by the way, to your listeners' question, like, I don't want to tell anyone how they should be consuming energy, right? Like, I don't think that fundamentally people like to be told what to do. And by the way, as an example, like, I have read a lot about sleep. I like my room to be very cold when I sleep, and I turn it down to 64 degrees. My wife and I do. Yeah. And like, I don't want some energy company being like, hey, sorry, you can't do that, like that, or a politician.
Right.
Like, that doesn't sound reasonable to me at all. I think the solution lies in this other things we've been talking about.
No, so it's been very clear to me that you approach these things from a very sort of libertarian ethos, and then ultimately, using the market economy in order to solve these problems. So hopefully my audience also sees the same. But
yeah, and listen, if you disagree with some of what I'm saying, like, awesome, go read the book.
Sure.
And my
for sure.
emails everywhere. Like, send me a note. I love hearing from people that have different ideas, because I learn from it, right? And I didn't start the book. Where I ended up was not where I started, right? And that's like any good writing process should be like that.
Yeah. Thank you, Brett, for the the perfect picture. So let's talk a little bit about one of the other things that you talked about is economies actually shifting from a mindset of short-term profits. Everybody's, if you're a public company, especially, you're thinking about the next quarter, the quarterly reports are coming out and whatever. When you're thinking in such small time frames, you have to make decisions that probably are bad for the long term. And you make the case that they are positioning themselves to be more long-term oriented. And I don't know that I necessarily see that broadly. You do see that with some organizations, but can you defend that position? I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's more aspirational than it is sort of happening broadly, right? So what we call sort of the next phase of capitalism, dynamic capitalism. It's not that dissimilar to what like the Business Roundtable came out with in 2019. We got an inside glimpse of that because Jamie Dimon was the chair of the Business Roundtable. That's a group of CEOs of the sort of roughly 200 largest companies in the United States. And in 2019, they talked about they issued the statement of a purpose of a corporation, and it expanded from just shareholders to include other stakeholders, employees, communities, suppliers, things like that. And mostly because that's kind of how companies, at least good companies, were running their businesses. It surprised me to learn that the half-life of a company on the Fortune 500 is 20 years, right? So they're actually not doing a great job of like organizing.
Perpetuating.
250 companies are, every 20 years are not on the Fortune 500 anymore, right?
Yeah.
Which means they've fallen off of it. Now that's you'd call this economic dynamism. It's an incredible trait of the U.S. economy, and we actually argue pretty powerfully that we're losing a bit of that dynamism, and we should endeavor to get it back, because this is really the strength of the U.S. economy, and not that every company needs to somehow go through this creative destruction and get sort of like, eaten up, but there's some amount of like new businesses. I mean, obviously we look at sort of the biggest companies in the world today, and a bunch of them didn't even exist, certainly 50 years ago, and were shadows of what they are today, 10 or 15 years ago. So
Yeah.
That's a good thing for the U.S. economy. And so what we describe in dynamic capitalism, one of the key, really the first key tenet, is this idea of a longer term orientation. And we think that just makes more sense for businesses who want to not be in the 20, or the 250 that are gone in 20 years, right? I mean,
Right.
you've got to think kind of past that. But shareholder capitalism, Friedman economics, really incentivize short-term thinking, like so much that it just kind of poisoned managers into thinking that was actually the way to create long-term sustainable success. And that just isn't the case. And really, the most famous example of that was GE under Jack Welch, who was sort of a poster child for neoliberalism. And he had this incredible run and it looked amazing. And then it turned out to all be accounting fraud and a house of cards, right? And GE went from being at the time the most valuable company in the world to really, a shadow of itself. I think it might have been delisted from the Dow Jones. And and because none of it was actually real, so you can't even point to the interim period and be like, well, it did good for a while, well for a while. Like, it was all BS anyway. So that's what we argue for, is like this longer term orientation, this idea of creating more capitalists through a whole bunch of different mechanisms, including things like employee ownership. The rule of law is pretty important now, right? We talk about that and why having like an understanding of the rules of the game is really important. So like all of these things are things that comprise this notion that we call dynamic capitalism. It's not like some crazy departure from neoliberalism. It's just like neoliberalism a little better. And by the way, it's kind of what we did in the golden age of capitalism, when the US was growing faster than it's growing now. And, and by the way, that golden age of capitalism was a reaction to really the Great Depression and, the effects of the 1929 crash. And then, the handful of years after that, when things looked a little bit like they look today. It's probably a bad form to pitch someone else's book on a podcast about mine, but I thought Andrew Ross Sorkin's book in 1929 was really, I just finished it a week ago. It's really interesting reading. He's a great storyteller just in general. He's the guy behind Billions and some other stuff. He tells the story of the Great Depression and sort of and the years after it. It was really interesting to think about that in the context of today.
Yeah, no, the pivot on those things is fascinating. And there's so many systemic things. I mean, you can talk about just the debt, or you can talk about just, the nature of home ownership, or, and any number of these things where you can say, well, this was the problem. It really, it was a whole bunch of problems, global problems, internal problems, and individual, human sociological problems that led to it. But when I look at
some policy decisions too, right? Like some really bad policy decisions, especially sort of becoming too isolationist, right? With the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which really exacerbated. And by the way, Hoover did stupid stuff too, right? Like he raised taxes.
Hoover was a nightmare.
Made no sense. So there's a bunch of things that contributed to it. And actually there's an open question, and Sorkin talks about this, of like, would it have been as bad if we had better monetary policy and some better just policies in general? It probably would have been a lot better if it wasn't for even just the tariffs. Like if you look at the tariffs and make it, okay, now it's more difficult to buy things in this country after we all got more poor. And it's like, and actually that's the kind of thing that actually really frightens me about Trump, is he has that sort of Hoover. It's like a mix of like Teddy Roosevelt and Hoover's policies on a lot of these things. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I don't love it. About Trump is like, he's so often diagnoses the problem and even has some hints of the right solution, and then he takes it off the rails, right? Like, I'm not against the strategic use of tariffs in the right circumstances, but it's just like the way it was applied in this accounts, trade balance way of trying to come up with tariff, like none of that made any sense. So he's like, he's right to think about, should we look at tariff? He was totally right to think about, do we need to have a more comprehensive and thoughtful immigration policy? Like, absolutely. Right. Should we be pulling people off the streets by like, no, I don't think that. And so it's like, oh, like you take one step in the right direction and then they go off the rails. Like punishing Switzerland more than China, with the tariff policy, and it's a little bit like, okay, wait, do we actually have problems with the Swiss? Or tariffing Vietnam heavier than China? Like, where do you think we're trying to move manufacturing to? Right. Yeah. And I understand bringing some of it back to the U.S. and the CHIPS Act was trying to do that, and I think leaning into some of those aspects makes sense. Like, we went a little crazy with outsourcing, But like again, it just feels so like diagnosing a problem really good, and then the solution becomes sort of, at least to me, all over the place. And I'm saying this out loud because people should write me their emails about why they disagree with that, because I love hearing other perspectives on this.
That's actually a really good point too. I say that myself when I talk to anybody of a disposition. I say, look, I probably agree with most of your criticisms of any one thing. Where we're going to disagree is on the solution. Yeah. And because the problems are obvious, right? Like, hey, I feel poorer, which means I probably am poorer. And, you know, that like, however, you know, how do we get there? Is it more socialism? Is it more capitalism? Is it more, you know, whatever? But it's a fascinating piece of psychology. I just realized we're at the top of the hour here. So Seth, I would love to give you, you know, is there anything I didn't ask you or some final word you'd like to say about your book or about anything else?
This was super fun. I hope people found it engaging and enjoyable. And, you know, no one writes a book to like make money, basically. Like, you write a book because you want to get some ideas out in the world. And, you know, I want as many people to read it as possible because I'm actually genuinely interested in both areas of agreement and areas of disagreement. So the book, it's called Capital Evolution. It's on sale on December 9th. You can already pick it up now and pre-order it. And I would appreciate it if people would do that, because I'm really excited to hear people's reactions to the ideas that we have.
That's great. Seth, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation. A little bit of a departure from the typical show, but I love macroeconomics and politics and all of this. So it's been really refreshing. We'll drop you down to the green room. Please hang on. I want to talk to you after the show, but thanks for coming on.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. That was Seth Levine. You can learn more about him. I believe it was sethlevine.com, and his book is on sale now. So go pick it up. It really, again, I came into it blind, ended up loving it. So I think if you have opinions about how the world can be made a better place through truly the market process and through the individual entrepreneurship and treating capitalism like a tool to solve problems, no matter where you think the problems come from, I think it really plays it out really well. So again, everybody, hi, and also nearing goodbye. But let's talk about being good to each other, because that's how I end every show here. Is that truly being good to each other? Is that like engaging in fair trade and free trade? Is the thing that allows us to be good to each other at an increasing velocity over time. And so try to apply that to your lives. And also, please like, subscribe, and hit the alert bell. It lets everybody know that you do continue or want to continue to watch my show at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time every single Tuesday. And it's always been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and comments and all the rest of it. Also, the discussion that was being had in the box itself is super encouraging. So everybody, thank you. We will see you next week. I'm Kurt Wuckert Jr. This has been the CoinGeek Weekly Live Stream. Take care.